What's the scariest, most bone-chilling moment you have ever witnessed? Story 1. I received a phone call at work around 8 ante-meridiem from a friend who worked at the sheriff's department, telling me there had been an attempted break-in at my house and that I needed to get home immediately. This was before mobile phones, so I drove home as fast as I could and found several police cars in my yard, with two men sitting in the back of one patrol car and a strange vehicle parked nearby. We lived out in the country, and our house could not be seen from the road. What had happened was that my two older children, aged 13 and 11, had been home alone because it was a teacher workday at their school. They woke up to our very small dog barking uncontrollably because our larger outside dog had intercepted the two men when they entered the yard to rob the house. The larger dog kept them cornered while the smaller dog's frantic barking woke the kids, who called the police. The officers waited for me to arrive so I could secure the larger dog before they collected evidence, and even the sheriff was clearly nervous around her. The children were unsure of what was happening, and the sheriff did not want them opening the door because he did not want the smaller dog to escape while still barking nonstop. The larger dog weighed about 30 pounds and the smaller one about 8 pounds. It turned out the men had been burglarizing the area for months and knew most people's work schedules, but they did not account for my dogs. The larger dog roughed them up badly, and the smaller dog was so stressed that he slept the rest of the day. Both dogs were rewarded with plenty of treats. Story 2. I was the victim of a severe road rage incident. I am a small 26-year-old woman driving a Mazda 3. At roughly 7 in the morning during winter, on mountain county back roads, a massive Ford 350 decided I was going too slow. He started accelerating as if he was going to ram into me, then at the last moment passed me illegally on a curve. He pulled in front of me and immediately slammed on his brakes. I slammed on mine and narrowly avoided hitting him. We sat there for about a minute when he began revving his engine. He then put his truck into reverse and tried to hit my car. I started screaming and reversed as well, and we were both driving down the mountain in reverse. I used my Bluetooth system to call 911, but the operator could not understand what I was saying because I was screaming. After about 100 yards of driving backward, he stopped, and I stopped as well for reasons I still do not understand. I began talking to the 911 operator when the man got out of his truck holding a weapon and started running toward me. I screamed again, and when another car appeared in the distance, the man ran back to his truck and fled. I have never been so scared in my entire life, and I had never truly believed I was about to be murdered until that moment. It is a feeling that never leaves you, even though it is difficult to explain. I cried and shook uncontrollably for the next 6 hours, and I no longer drive on that road. Story 3. This happened about 1 month ago when I picked up my sister from a party. I was driving home when I noticed a black car ahead of me, going about 15 miles per hour, flashing its brake lights, turning on its left signal while making right turns. Growing impatient, I decided to illegally cut him off so I could just get home. After I did that, he sped up and began flashing his fog lights, signaling for me to pull over. I kept driving, feeling increasingly creeped out. My house was only a couple of miles away, with many turns along the route, but the man continued tailgating me and actively pursuing me, which became genuinely terrifying. I ended up driving nearly 50 miles within a radius of maybe 10 miles, desperately trying to lose him. Eventually, I made a left turn where he could not follow without risking a collision with another car. I quickly pulled over and turned off all my lights, holding my breath as I watched his car slowly drive past, hoping he would not notice me. After about 15 minutes, I looked around, then carefully drove home. My sister was drunk and asleep the entire time and never even realized what had happened. Story 4. This one is a bit different, but it is the most scared I have ever been and probably the closest I have ever come to death. I was completely alone, riding a motorcycle in a spirited manner on a remote forested mountain road that is well known among motorcycle riders. I came around a blind but high-speed corner at about 70 miles per hour when I suddenly found myself face to face with a herd of around 20 elk crossing directly in front of me. I literally could not see the road on the other side of them, just a solid wall of animals weighing well over 600 pounds each and standing more than 6 feet tall. I had just enough time to close my eyes, and that was it. At that speed, it would have taken more than 200 feet to stop, and I had maybe 20 feet and no clear path through. Somehow, and I will never know exactly how, I made it through completely unscathed. I remember hearing their hooves striking the pavement as I passed. I pulled over and looked back just in time to see the last of them disappearing into the woods. I turned off my bike, got off, and sat on the side of the road for about 30 minutes until I mostly stopped shaking. After that, I rode home very slowly. I have not ridden that road since, and I never ride anymore without a helmet camera. Story 5. The scariest moment happened when I was about 16 and on my way to help decorate for a school dance. A buddy and I decided to go grab some snacks and drinks for everyone, and he was driving his hatchback Camaro from the 1990s. About halfway back with the snacks, we were coming around a fairly sharp right curve when a truck suddenly came flying toward us, partially in our lane. My friend swerved and overcorrected a few times until we were mostly straight, not realizing we were still sliding toward the ditch. He tried to save it, but we hit the ditch on the driver's side while still moving fairly fast. The last thing I remember before blacking out was being airborne as the car careened into the ditch. When I came to, the car was mangled, upside down, and facing the opposite direction from where we had been traveling, and both of us were hanging upside down in our seats. He was still unconscious, with his head tilted sideways against the roof. I had to crawl out through the broken rear hatch window because the doors were crushed. A man was standing across the road who happened to live directly where we crashed, and he told us that we hit the ditch, flipped, and the top of the car struck a tree before rolling back down upside down. I had a mild concussion, and he cracked a bone in his neck but was not paralyzed. We were incredibly lucky, and I still get nervous riding as a passenger. Another bone-chilling moment came the day I had to use all the cardiopulmonary resuscitation training I never thought I would need. While working at a grocery store, I heard a woman screaming from one of the aisles, and another woman ran toward the front in a panic asking if anyone knew cardiopulmonary resuscitation because a man had collapsed and was not breathing. I closed my lane with people still waiting and met a pharmacist halfway to him, and the two of us were the only ones trained. We worked on him for about 30 minutes, switching every few minutes when one of us became exhausted. A woman returned to the store a few days later and told us she was a relative and that he did not survive, but she thanked us for trying so hard to keep him alive until the paramedics arrived. I still remember it as if it happened yesterday. Story 6. I once witnessed the aftermath of a bar fight that I never want to see repeated. A smaller intoxicated man kept provoking a much larger sober man for no clear reason, and eventually the larger man struck him once, but from what I heard it was a very forceful blow. I found the smaller man lying between two pool tables after he fell backward and hit his head hard, and there was visible bleeding. He was completely unconscious and did not respond to any attempts to wake him while we waited for the ambulance. The way he was breathing was the most disturbing thing I had ever witnessed. Deep, harsh breaths as if his body was operating purely on survival instinct to keep air moving. Blood was coming from his mouth because several of his teeth had been knocked loose. When emergency medical services finally arrived and took him away, I could barely look at him, seeing someone so utterly helpless. He had also lost control of his bladder. I later learned he had to be airlifted to a larger hospital due to bleeding in his brain, but he eventually recovered and reportedly returned to his old habits. I never want to witness someone in that condition ever again. Story 7. My group of friends used to play a game we called Run. We would play late at night, starting around 1 ante-meridiem, when the streets were empty since our town was very small. We would walk down to Main Street and stand outside the post office or the grocery store, hanging out, talking, and messing around until the local police officer drove by. We would stay just long enough for him to see us, then scatter and run in different directions, and the officer would chase us through town for the rest of the night. As long as we stopped, if he turned on his lights or siren, we never got in trouble. We did this often, and the police seemed to enjoy the game, sometimes even getting out of the car to chase us on foot, and it was exhilarating and a lot of fun. One night we played until around 4 ante-meridiem, when the birds started singing and the sky began to turn gray, so we decided to head home. While walking along a road parallel to the main highway, we heard a massive boom that sounded like a bomb had gone off. We ran toward the sound and reached the local auto parts store, where we saw a truck that had plowed straight into the side of the building. There were no police or emergency services there yet, and this was before mobile phones. So one of my friends ran to the nearest house to call 911, while the rest of us cautiously approached the vehicle to check on the driver. What we saw is hard to describe, as it looked like the lower half of the man was still in the driver's seat while his upper body had shifted into the passenger side, leaving him in two parts. What shocked me most was how ordinary it looked, not stylized or dramatic like in movies, just his mangled body sitting there in silence. A few moments later, tribal police from a casino about 40 minutes away arrived with their sirens on, followed shortly by local police, ambulances, and the fire department. We later learned the man had stolen money from the casino and was being chased, and due to the rain and a sharp curve near the store, he drifted over the curb and crashed sideways into the building. The most disturbing part was how the entire town came out to watch, with people lining lawns and sidewalks for hours while crews worked to remove the body and even climbing onto rooftops when sheets and tarps were raised, all just to see a man who had died in a horrific way. Story 8, I used to work emergency night shifts, and one evening a woman called saying her dog was bleeding from his nose. I advised them to come in immediately, although they did not sound extremely distressed, just concerned. I went to unlock the practice, and when their car arrived, the woman stepped out smiling and thanking me for coming out. She then went to the back of the car, where the dog was, and when she opened the trunk, she let out a scream so devastating it stopped me in my tracks. I ran over and saw their poor spaniel lying in a pool of blood, with the entire trunk covered. It turned out that a blood vessel in the dog's lungs had eroded, likely due to cancer that had gone unnoticed because he showed no major signs of illness besides slight lethargy, and he had bled out through his respiratory tract during the drive. The dog was already gone. I have never heard screams so full of grief, and they will haunt me for the rest of my life. I spent 2 hours with the family, consoling them and listening as they shared memories of their dog as he was in life. I have never been so shaken by a single sound as I was by that woman's cry, and the shock of that moment has never left me. Story 9. This experience affected me so deeply that I cannot even remember how old I was. Only that I was in elementary school before grade 4, and that I have more memories from before kindergarten than from that entire period, except for this one, which is painfully vivid. I woke up to my mother screaming and ran from my bedroom to see her collapse on the floor holding my infant brother, who had passed away from sudden infant death syndrome during the night. My father woke my other brother, put us both into the car, and my mother got in while alternating between sobbing and attempting cardiopulmonary resuscitation as my father drove us to the nearest fire station. Years later, when I was pregnant with my third child, I was so terrified that he would be a boy and die like my brother that I spiraled into severe emotional distress and feared I would not survive facing that loss. I was referred to counseling and had my first appointment just hours before my anatomy scan. The appointment where you learn the baby's S, and I found out my third child was a boy. For the rest of the pregnancy, I refused to buy anything except his bed. We bought diapers on the way home from the hospital, and I stopped breastfeeding so I could take stronger antidepressants. I was on multiple medications that prevented me from acting on harmful thoughts but did little else, and I struggled to bond with my son, convinced he resented me despite being so attached that only I could hold him without him crying. The only memory I had of my second brother alive was Christmas, so I convinced myself that if my son lived past Christmas, I could finally stop worrying, and after that I stopped taking my medication entirely. Things improved slowly, but never completely, and although he celebrated his first birthday a few weeks ago, and I am no longer afraid to bond with him, I still experience panic whenever we pass a fire station. Story 10. Years ago, I lived next door to a very reclusive, alcoholic, middle-aged father and his young adult son. They shared a basement studio apartment in a very old building with paper-thin walls, which hardly mattered because they stayed up until ungodly hours, screaming at each other in Korean and throwing things against the walls. However, if I made even the slightest noise in my apartment, something as simple as closing a kitchen cabinet or turning on the sink, they would start banging on the walls, screaming at me, and sometimes even opening their door to yell down the hallway at mine. It was impossible to deal with, especially since I already struggled with anxiety, and this situation only made it worse. One morning I received a package that had been delivered early and left in front of my door, and I assume it somehow inconvenienced them, even though it was not large. I woke up later to hysterical howling and an incredibly loud banging sound, like wood cracking, coming from inside my apartment. I ran into the living room in my pajamas, half asleep, and saw my front door barely hanging onto splintered pieces of the frame as my neighbor repeatedly threw his full body weight into it, trying to kick it down, while cracks slowly spread across the frame. I was absolutely terrified. A 5'1", 20-year-old woman, home alone with no way to defend myself, genuinely believing that if he broke in, he might kill me. After several moments, he suddenly stopped and went back into his apartment as if nothing had happened. I spent the rest of that day crying in my closet on the phone with my boyfriend at the time, and I moved out not long after. Story 11, I work in a healthcare setting, and one of the most frightening experiences involved a client who suffers from seizures. During these episodes, their tongue would bleed, and their eyes would appear as if they were bulging from their skull. The first time I witnessed it, I was called over to assist and had to position them on their side to prevent choking on blood, while also supporting them so they would not fall or tip out of their wheelchair. I looked into their eyes while gently running my fingers through their hair to help keep them calm, and watching another person's pupils dilate until there was nothing but black, while their eyes turned bloodshot, was deeply disturbing to me. At certain points during the seizure, they would stop breathing altogether. The entire experience was terrifying and left me barely holding back tears. A coworker of mine experienced something equally traumatic when a client began choking and could not cough up the obstruction. Emergency services were called, and staff attempted to create an airway so the person could breathe, but there was heavy bleeding and they were unable to save them. That individual died on the floor in front of my coworker and other staff members. I try to remain vague about details to protect identities in case family members ever come across this. Outside of my job, one of the most unsettling events of my life happened when a former roommate triggered a police raid on our home, and I found myself staring down the barrel of a gun. Not long after, we discovered that he had been downloading explicit content involving children. At first, we desperately tried to believe it was some kind of misunderstanding, anything other than what it appeared to be, but that illusion collapsed when a detective laid out the ages involved. That moment completely broke something inside me. The realization that someone I lived with, someone I thought I understood, had been committing acts that horrific just a few steps away was deeply traumatizing. For more than a month afterward, I could barely function in public, and it permanently altered how I see people in the world around me. Story 12, I would not describe this as pure terror, but it left me profoundly shaken. I was running errands at a small strip mall in a quiet town, and while browsing in one of the shops, I noticed a man walk past me. I gave a polite nod and smile and continued shopping. Afterward, I needed to stop at the supermarket that served as the anchor store for the plaza. As I walked back to my vehicle after leaving another shop, I noticed the same man sitting in a truck parked beside my car, which I brushed off as a coincidence. I drove to the supermarket at the opposite end of the strip, went inside briefly, and returned to my vehicle, only to see his truck parked directly next to mine again. As I climbed into my van, I noticed an enormous container of petroleum jelly, and within seconds, my brain caught up with what I was seeing. The man was smiling at me, exposing himself, and engaging in obscene behavior. I deliberately looked away and called my husband, who was working the night shift as a police officer, calmly explaining what was happening, describing the man, his vehicle, and our exact location. In under half a minute, every on-duty officer in our very small town arrived, including my husband. I was sent home while they took him into custody. I felt relieved until I later learned that the man had cognitive challenges and had recently lost his mother, who had been his primary support. He was not charged that night, but was taken to a mental health facility for evaluation, and I never heard anything more about him. As for truly bone-chilling experiences, I have had many, especially from my time working as a legal secretary. I spent countless hours transcribing statements from people accused of violent crimes, most of which involved tragic but common situations, until one case forced me to transcribe audio of two young men begging for their lives while sitting fully clothed in a dry bathtub, only to be mocked and killed by a group of attackers who continued to desecrate their bodies afterward. Hearing the fear, pleading, and cruelty in that recording was more than I could bear, and that case haunted me so deeply that I quit my job the following week. Story 13. In 1996, when I was 19 years old, I went on an interrail trip around Europe with my boyfriend at the time. It was the best trip of my life and cost next to nothing compared to what I spend on holidays now with my two children. While we were on the Greek island of Corfu, some ferry routes being part of the interrail system, we rented small 50 cubic centimeter mopeds for a couple of days so we could explore the island. One night, around 11:30 post-meridium, under a very dark and cloudy sky, we were heading back to our hostel on a steep, winding mountain road with sheer cliff drops along the side. It was already frightening, but then a truck came racing toward us around a blind bend on the wrong side of the road, his full-beam headlights completely blinding me. I tried to pull over to avoid being hit, skidded, and went straight off the cliff edge at about 30 miles per hour. I vividly remember the sensation of flying and falling, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears it felt deafening. I remember holding my breath the entire time, though my boyfriend later told me I was screaming. Then everything went dark, as if I had blacked out or fallen asleep. And what felt like centuries later, I opened my eyes to total darkness and silence. I thought that at least dying did not hurt, then realized I was still thinking, waiting for everything to stop, knowing something inevitable was coming, and there was nothing I could do. That waiting was the most terrifying moment of my life. Suddenly, I heard distant shouting in another language and noticed tiny points of white light above me, and I realized I could see stars and lights from the shore. My boyfriend was screaming my name, and I understood I was alive, hanging almost upside down, caught by my backpack straps in a tree growing out of the cliff. It took a long time for them to rescue me, and the moped rental shop was furious about their lost moped. I have ridden one again since, but only briefly, and my family has never heard the story because even now they would probably lock me away to keep me from doing anything so reckless again. Story 14. Years ago, I worked as a concierge, mostly second shift from 3 post-meridium to 11 post-meridium. Near the end of one shift, I was asked to deliver an item to a guest room, and instead of taking the service elevator in the back, I chose the main elevator in the lobby. When I arrived, a woman was waiting, so I let her go first and said I would take the next one, since there were 3 elevators. She stepped inside and the doors closed, and I waited for it to move before calling the next elevator. But after a moment, I noticed it never went anywhere. I pressed the button anyway, expecting the doors to reopen, but when they did, the elevator was completely empty. The feeling was bone-chilling and skin-crawling, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I immediately told the front desk that I was done for the night and explained why. The next day, I told some of the housekeepers what had happened, and after I described what the woman looked like, they showed me an old staff photo from about 10 years earlier. It was her. She had been murdered during a robbery about 8 years before in the gift shop, which had since been renovated into a business center, and several housekeepers admitted they had seen her late at night walking the halls. Story 15. While snowboarding in Colorado, a friend and I were doing laps through the terrain park, and one of the jumps had grown unsafe because the landing no longer matched the size of the jump, meaning if you hit it slowly, you would land at the very bottom of the landing. We both went over it once, and I landed on the flat area beyond the landing, and while riding the lift back up, about 10 meters away, I pointed it out and said we should not hit it again because it was dangerous. Less than 5 seconds later, a skier came flying down with speed, hit the jump cleanly, cleared the landing, cleared the flat, and landed on the bottom of the next jump's takeoff, which was nearly perpendicular to his direction of travel. What followed was the loudest, most horrifying cracking sound as his femur snapped, followed by a blood-curdling scream. We watched from about 15 meters away, completely helpless, and by the time we reached the top, we alerted ski patrol. When we got back down, he was being helped by others in the park and was still screaming, and the sound of it has never left me. Story 16. This happened to me recently during a very difficult period of my life. I was going through a painful divorce and had moved into a house by myself near work about 4 months earlier. And although I have a young daughter, I had not been able to see her during that time due to a legal order that was later dropped, allowing shared custody to begin the following weekend. That past weekend, my mother came to help me make the house feel more like a home, and we bought furniture, decorations, rugs, and everything we could to make it welcoming. Before setting up my daughter's room, I had kept my cat's litter box there while it was empty, but after moving it to another room, my cat refused to use it and instead soiled the new rugs whenever we were gone, forcing us to spend the weekend repeatedly deep cleaning. Eventually, I put the litter box back in my daughter's room temporarily. On Monday evening, after dropping my mother at the airport, I returned home, spent the night drinking and watching movies, and went to bed around 11:30 post-meridium. Around 4:30 ante-meridium, I woke up to an overwhelming, nauseating smell that I assumed was from my cat. But after checking every room and finding nothing unusual, I locked my door again and lay awake trying to make sense of it. Shortly after 5 ante-meridium, I used the bathroom and returned to bed, listening to the toilet finish draining in total silence, when I suddenly heard a sniff and someone clearing their throat coming from my closet. Instinct took over and I fled the house, calling the police from my car. When officers arrived and searched the house, they found a very thin homeless man hiding in my closet, and he was taken away in handcuffs. The man had entered through a sliding glass door while I was gone earlier that evening and hid when he heard me return. And the horrible smell that woke me was his body odor coming from just a few feet away. Realizing that someone had been inside my home the entire night, and imagining what could have happened if I had opened that closet, or if my daughter had been there, still sends chills through me. Story 17. Watching my cat die was the most painful thing I have ever experienced. I adopted him when he was barely 8 weeks old, and he lived to be 15 years old. He was my best friend, a soulmate in the sense of companionship, if you understand what I mean by that, and we grew up together, changing and maturing alongside each other. He passed away recently in mid-March of this year. His kidneys were failing, although we did not realize it at first because he had been acting completely normal, eating, drinking, and sleeping as usual. One night he got into a fight with one of my best friend's cats, who was also my landlord and roommate, and afterward he began urinating a small amount of blood. We assumed he had torn or injured something during the fight, since he was no longer a young Tom. This happened around 11 post-meridium, but fortunately we lived close to an emergency 24-hour veterinary clinic, so we rushed him there. Test results later that night showed the fight was unrelated and that the real issue was his kidneys. The veterinarian explained that animals can sometimes sense illness in other animals of the same species and may act out to draw attention, and they had seen similar cases before. He was so tired, and in the span of 24 hours, he changed dramatically. I had to make the heartbreaking decision to have him euthanized, and I stayed with him to say goodbye and comfort him at the end. When the medication was administered, he was gone almost instantly, and watching the life fade from his beautiful, heterochromatic eyes in less than a second is something that will stay with me forever. Even writing this is incredibly painful. I miss him so much. I miss you, Iris. Story 18. I was once at a Carl's Jr. near the border between Mexico and the United States of America at around 2 to 3 ante-meridium. I was sitting alone at a table, and the place was very crowded when two men sat down across from me. I did not think much of it at first, assuming they just needed somewhere to sit, but the man closest to me, a heavy-set bald man with tattoos on his arms and neck, leaned in and said something along the lines of asking why I was there, and implying he could force me into his car and no one would know. I felt a wave of pure terror hit my stomach, and I knew that if I reacted with fear or lost my composure, something bad could happen. That was when I noticed the words Nueva Generación among the tattoos on his neck. I tried to think of what to say for what felt like an eternity, and finally all I managed was telling him that he might regret it. He and his friend laughed and walked out of the restaurant. I now believe they were just trying to intimidate me for their own amusement, but it was one of the most frightening moments of my life, and I have avoided the border area ever since. Story 19. I never thought I would share this story with strangers, but here it is. My mother, my sister, and I lived together in a small apartment, and an important detail is that my mother was a psychiatrist who later lost her license after a serious incident with a patient, which meant she had access to a large collection of prescription medications and other substances. On my sister's 13th birthday, my mother consumed an entire bottle of cough syrup, an extreme amount of alcohol, and likely other substances as well. By around 11 post-meridium, my sister and her friends were making plans to sleep in the living room, when my mother began behaving inappropriately toward her friends and insisted on sleeping next to them. When my sister refused, my mother struck her across the face so hard I could hear it through my bedroom door. Moments later, my sister grabbed the phone and told me to call the police and our father while she blocked my door with her body. My mother screamed threats and broke my door while holding a large knife, and I barely had time to tell the emergency dispatcher our address before she pointed the knife at me and demanded the phone. My sister grabbed it back, screaming for help, as our mother seized her by the throat and lifted her against the window. Fortunately, the police station was only about a 5-minute walk away, and officers arrived roughly 10 minutes into our standoff. When we saw the flashing lights outside, my mother dropped my sister and locked herself in her room. I will never forget the look in her eyes as she pointed the knife at me, and it still gives me nightmares years later. There was no happy ending afterward, as our father was similarly unstable, and my sister and I were separated and eventually became homeless. I was taken in by friends I now consider family, but my sister was not as fortunate, and I have not seen her in about a year because she remains in an abusive relationship despite insisting everything is fine. Story 20. When I was younger, the neighborhood boys and I went through a phase where we were obsessed with climbing trees. Big or small, we would meet up and climb whatever trees we could find in the area. When my mom found out, she forbade it and warned me that I was going to hurt myself one day. Being a kid, I ignored her, convinced that as long as I was careful, nothing bad could happen. One afternoon, the boys and I gathered at a friend's house and started climbing a massive oak tree in his backyard. One I had climbed many times before and loved because it overlooked his 2-story house. What made that day different was that it had rained only a few hours earlier, leaving the branches slick. I climbed all the way to the top and turned around to head back down toward my friends below when I suddenly lost my footing and fell. Everything happened so fast that there was no time to feel fear. I fell headfirst from the top of the tree, missing nearly every branch on the way down until the very last one, about 6 feet from the ground. My legs buckled as I fell, and somehow I caught myself on that final branch, left hanging upside down and staring at the ground beneath me. As the adrenaline hit, the only thought in my head was disbelief at what had just happened. To this day, I am convinced that I would have either died or broken my neck if I had not caught that branch, which makes it even more unsettling to think back on. Story 21. Another moment that will always stay with me is the events of September 11. I was in my second semester of college, getting ready to head to an early morning class. I had just woken up and was online chatting when a friend from the dorm next door sent me a message telling me to turn on the television. At first I refused because my roommate was still asleep, but he insisted, so I turned it on and woke him. I did not immediately skip class, and on my walk across campus, I passed through the student center just in time to see the second tower struck live on television. When I finally reached class on the other side of campus, a student stumbled out of the room, burst into tears, and collapsed into the arms of classmates, clearly devastated in a way that felt deeply personal. I did not ask questions, but the shock in that moment was overwhelming. I lingered briefly before turning around and going back to my room for the rest of the day. The weeks that followed were a blur, with an eerie quiet settling over everything and a heavy presence of federal agents around campus. I attended a well-known private aeronautical university, and even though there was no direct connection, it felt undeniable that the world and my future plans had changed forever. Story 22. The scariest moment of my life may have been the night I nearly fell asleep at the wheel while driving home from my ex's house. I would usually pick her up from work on the weekends and we would go out, but she always had to be home by around 2 or 3 ante meridium. That night I had been awake since 6 ante meridium and was already exhausted, but I still had to drive her home. During the drive I struggled to stay awake, and she kept talking to me to help keep me alert. After I dropped her off, she reminded me to drive safely and told me to pull over and call her if I could not make it home. About 10 minutes from my house, I reached the point where I could barely keep my eyes open. smacking my face to stay awake and telling myself I was almost there. The next thing I realized was that I had somehow parked my car on a main street, poorly parallel parked, with no memory of how I got there. I had driven several blocks past my usual turn and had absolutely no recollection of the drive. The realization terrified me, knowing I had been driving on autopilot in the middle of the night with no awareness. I decided to stay put, sent a quick message saying I was going to nap in the car, and did not wake up until 9 ante meridiem, when a police officer knocked on my window to check on me. Story 23. I do not know if this experience was truly bone-chilling, but it is permanently burned into my memory. When I was in high school, I traveled to Colorado with friends, and we decided to climb a small mountain near our hotel. The mountain was an easy hike if you followed the trail, but being young and reckless, we chose to climb straight up along a steep cliff face that ranged from 100 to 200 feet high. We were having fun, taking photos near the edge, when we spotted a small outcrop jutting out over the cliff that overlooked a beautiful valley. Naturally, we tried to climb down to it, eventually finding what seemed like the easiest route, which required jumping down 6 to 7 feet and across a 4-foot gap with nothing but open air below. When no one else was willing, I jumped and made it across. We got the photo, and then I faced the problem of getting back. Unable to jump back up, I had to free climb, and everything went fine until I ran out of hand and footholds. The next hold was around the corner of the cliff above nothing but empty space, and as I reached for it, my hand slipped and I fell. My mind went completely blank, as if I had accepted what was about to happen, until I miraculously landed on a tiny ledge, about 2 by 1 feet, sticking out from the cliff face. I had fallen about 15 feet and somehow stuck the landing. I climbed back up quickly, only realizing the gravity of what had happened once I reached the top and stood there shaking, fully aware of how close I had come to disaster. Story 24. I once had a terrifying experience during a psychedelic trip that completely altered how I viewed the world. I had never been a religious person, nor had I truly come to terms with my own mortality, and those unresolved feelings exploded into an intense existential crisis that lasted about an hour. The experience began calmly as I was with my fiancé and 2 friends, and we had just returned from a long walk through the forest. My fiancé and 1 friend decided to go back outside, but I stayed in with our other friend because it was cold and wet. We both deal with chronic pain and muscle tension, and he was interested in natural remedies and relaxation techniques, so we smoked a small amount of cannabis, stretched, and used essential oils. Somewhere during this, I slipped into a trance and completely lost control. I became trapped in a mental loop that I had never experienced before, with no perception of time passing, feeling as if I were constantly drifting into sleep and being jolted awake, restarting the same moment over and over. Nothing could pull me out of it, not music, conversation, or distractions. The sensation was deeply unsettling, like a morbid and helpless form of déjà vu that caused me to lose touch with reality. My friend was also experiencing the loop but remained calm because he understood what was happening, while I was overwhelmed with terror. I began screaming, convinced I was dying, believing I had entered a coma or was losing brain function, stuck forever in that moment, unable to see my family or my fiancé again. I was desperate to escape the room to prove I was alive, yet too afraid to hurt myself, resulting in frantic pacing and shouting about self-preservation. I only calmed down when my fiancé returned and held me, repeatedly grounding me in reality and reassuring me that time was moving and I was alive. I eventually settled, but the rest of the night was filled with paranoia. That experience cost me both friendships involved and sent me into a prolonged period of anxiety, depression, and dark thoughts, amplifying struggles I already had. Over time, I came to terms with it, and in an unexpected way, it forced me to develop a stronger understanding of myself and life, but it remains the most terrifying experience I can imagine. Story 25. I was 19 years old and working alone in a farm supply store when I experienced one of the most frightening moments of my life. We had many regular truck drivers who came in frequently, and most were familiar faces, but one man was always unsettling and inappropriate. One day during a staffing emergency at one of the grain mills, I found myself alone in the store. I heard the bell ring as someone entered and turned toward the front desk, only to see him walking slowly down the aisle toward me. He did not say a word, but he did not need to. I understood with absolute clarity what he intended to do, more clearly than I ever had before or since. I was cornered on three sides. He outweighed me by well over 100 pounds, and he was significantly taller. When he was about 8 feet away, the face of our young, athletic, and physically imposing manager appeared over the man's shoulder from across the store. He shouted the man's name once, firmly. In that instant, I knew he understood exactly what was happening, whether from the look on my face or prior knowledge of the man. The man turned and my manager calmly told him he would assist him, met him halfway across the store, and escorted him out. I never learned what was said, but that man, who had been a regular for a long time, never returned. My manager checked on me, told me the man was no longer welcome, asked if I was okay, and then we both returned to work. No one said much, but everyone understood. The silence, the shared awareness, and the unspoken danger made it one of the most chilling moments I have ever experienced. Story 26. This is not the scariest thing I have experienced, but it happened recently, and at the time I was filled with nothing but dread. It was my first shift as a supervisor in a coffee shop, and we were finishing up cleaning after closing when I asked my colleague if they had cleaned one of the bathrooms because it was locked. This was after closing, and I needed access so I could count the day's takings for security reasons. She said she had not cleaned it. I knocked on the door and asked if anyone was inside, but there was no reply. I called my manager, who told me to contact the shopping center security, but they had already gone home for the day, so I was instructed to call 999. I explained the situation to the operator, who told me to open the door, but I refused. My colleague looked at me like I was crazy, but when the operator asked what I thought I might find, my adrenaline was already pumping and my mind went wild, so I said anything from a burglar to a bomb or a body. I did not want to find out. He said the best response time would be about 15 minutes, but suggested I try to access the closed-circuit television system, and if I saw anything suspicious to call back so he could escalate it. After about 10 minutes of struggling with the computer, I finally got the cameras working, and my colleague and I sat watching. We saw an elderly woman enter the bathroom. We waited 10 minutes, then 15, then 30, and no one came out. I called back and told the operator that I could clearly see an elderly woman enter the restroom, but that no one was responding when I knocked. My manager arrived, and within 5 minutes, emergency services were there as well. The firefighters forced the door open and found nothing inside. In that moment, I was convinced an elderly woman had been hurt, or worse, on the other side of that door, and all I could feel was dread. Later that night, I became extremely frustrated because when I tried to show my manager the footage, it was gone. Earlier in the recording, however, we had seen a teenager touch the door as if checking whether it was occupied and then walk away. We believe he locked it intentionally and caused the entire panic for no reason. As for the footage of the elderly woman, we never found it again. But I take comfort in knowing my colleagues saw it with me and that I was not imagining things. Story 27. When I was around 6th grade, my friends and I used to play outside in the street, and one day an older boy, maybe around 11th grade, from a local orphanage decided to join us. We were young and let him hang around, but our parents were uneasy about him. Over time, we began to realize that his behavior was deeply disturbing. He would often linger out of sight, watching us play from behind bushes and behaving inappropriately, until one of the children eventually noticed and confronted him. After that moment, he disappeared for a while, and winter passed. One morning before school, I realized our front door was standing open and the key was gone. Our home was enclosed by a fence with an outer gate and a garage that could easily be accessed by climbing over a nearby decorative metal fence, and it was clear someone had entered the property that way. I followed a set of footprints that circled the entire house, passing beneath nearly every window. I called my mother to look, and she saw it too, so we changed the locks later that same day. Around 10 post-meridium, our neighbor knocked on the door, and after speaking with him for several minutes, my mother came back inside and immediately contacted the authorities. We learned that the neighbor had returned home late from work and caught someone attempting to unlock our door. He confronted the individual, who turned out to be the same person we had encountered before. The authorities took him in for questioning and discovered that he had entered our property, looked through our windows, and taken unauthorized photos of me as a child. His phone was seized, and although he was released after roughly 24 hours, he left the city shortly afterward and was never seen again. To this day, it remains the most unsettling experience of my life, and I still insist on using double curtains everywhere I live, even in apartments on upper floors. Story 28. I work as a local television photojournalist, and over the years I have witnessed many serious accidents. I am never directly involved, and graphic details are not shown on the news, but I have still seen a great deal of disturbing material. Strangely, most of it never truly affected me. I am not trying to sound hardened, and at times I even question whether something is wrong with me, but that has always been my reality. There was one night, however, that shook me more than anything I had ever encountered before. It was around 2:30 ante meridiem in January, and it was a slow night, so I stepped out to grab something to eat. As soon as I left the station, I saw flames shooting out of an upper floor window of the high-rise retirement home next door. It was clearly serious, so I called the station to ask if they had heard anything on the scanner yet, and they had not. I realized I was the only person there at that moment. I could hear sirens in the distance, so I knew help was coming, and I grabbed my camera and started filming. That was when I heard her. An elderly woman was trapped on a balcony, screaming for help and crying out that she was on fire. Using a long lens, I could see her fingers beneath the railing, with smoke and flames pouring out all around her. It only took a few minutes for a ladder truck to arrive, but it felt like hours. She could not be brought down the ladder, so firefighters had to wait until the fire was extinguished to bring her down through the building. But it was too late, and she passed away in the ambulance. Being there during the rescue was terrifying, but by the end, it appeared as though she had survived. The hardest part came later, while editing the footage, hearing her cries for help, and knowing she did not make it. Story 29. This one is very different from the others, but it deeply disturbed me. A few months ago, I read a news article about an elderly man, a former professional football player, who died in the hospital after someone connected an oxygen tank to his urinary catheter, causing his bladder to rupture. It is almost certain that he was intentionally killed. Under no circumstances could any medical professional accidentally connect oxygen tubing to a catheter, and witnesses reported hearing him screaming that he was dying as the injury occurred. He passed away within minutes, in extreme pain, and the rupture caused air to fill his body cavity and collapse his lungs. When investigators arrived, the catheter had been removed and placed in a bathroom sink, with no clear explanation of who removed it or who connected the oxygen tank in the first place. Despite numerous suspicious details, the incident was officially labeled as a medical error. The story traumatized me, especially because I previously had a suprapubic catheter following major surgery and experienced severe complications when the catheter balloon irritated my bladder wall. That pain alone was unbearable, and I cannot imagine what it would feel like to experience a rupture. The suffering he endured, combined with the fact that no one has been held responsible, terrified me on a level few things ever have. Story 30. When I was about 10 years old, I stayed at my aunt's house while she and her family were on vacation, helping pets sit with my sister and my mother. During the daytime, everything was great, with snacks, games, and freedom, but once night fell, strange things began to happen. I have never been particularly religious, and even now I try to explain it away as a child's imagination, but the memories remain incredibly vivid. I remember sitting alone in a well-lit room when the light began to fade, not flickering, just slowly dimming. And then the door suddenly closed. As I ran toward it, the walls seemed to ripple and move like currents, nearly causing me to fall. I curled up next to the dog afterward, trying to calm myself. Later that night, I slept on the couch, and sometime around 2 ante meridiem, I noticed a reflection in the glass cabinets across from me, showing the sliding glass doors behind. In the reflection, I could see what looked like a pair of long, thick, animal-like legs leading up to a strange upper body partially obscured by a curtain. Fear completely paralyzed me, and I stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity as passing headlights briefly illuminated the shape, revealing a tall, thin figure with a broad upper body but no visible head. When morning finally came, and my mother began moving around the house, The reflection was gone. I have never felt relief like that since, and despite searching the yard afterward, there was nothing that could have cast such a detailed shadow. I have never experienced anything similar again, but the memory still fills me with unease. Story 31. Normally I think of one of two scary moments from junior high or high school that gave me a serious scare, but they were not truly serious events. So for this, I will share something I rarely talk about from my military service. Around 2007, I served near the Gaza Strip in the Israel Defense Forces, in the Armored Corps, during a particularly aggressive period. We regularly conducted operations inside the area to hunt armed militants, sometimes almost daily, and at times these missions involved entire tank platoons alongside large infantry units for 48 hours or more. The strategy was to move in, take positions, and wait, knowing that armed fighters would eventually engage us, which reduced civilian presence and limited collateral harm. During one such engagement, my squad was pursuing several fighters who were firing rocket-propelled grenades at our tanks as they ran between buildings on the edge of a town, occasionally peeking out to shoot. Civilians appeared to have fled, so we were cleared to engage. At one point, I saw one repeatedly peeking around a corner to fire, and I received authorization from my commander to take him out. I waited, finger tense on the trigger, watching for the next moment he would expose himself. Suddenly, something moved behind the wall, and I nearly fired, but my mind processed what I was seeing just in time. A small girl, probably around 5 years old, had been shoved forward into the open, seemingly placed there so I would shoot her and her death could be used as propaganda. She stood frozen for a moment, staring at our tanks in confusion, then began crying and tried to run back, but all I could see were hands forcing her forward again. I have never felt such fear and rage at the same time, realizing how close I came to doing something irreversible because someone was willing to sacrifice a child. Story 32. A few months ago, I was driving home from college late at night, alone, as a woman in my early 20s, on an empty freeway. Around 11 post-meridiem, I received a call from an anonymous number, which I normally would not answer, but something felt off, so I picked up. A man on the other end calmly listed my exact location, my full name, my age, and details about what and where I studied, then asked me to confirm them. Panicking, I hung up immediately and tried to call someone, but before I could, an unmarked vehicle activated sirens behind me and pulled me over. Two men in plain clothes exited the car, identified themselves as undercover police, and asked for my license and registration, which I gave them. They then instructed me to step out of the car while one of them searched through my vehicle as I stood facing away from the road. After about 10 minutes, another car stopped nearby, possibly due to a breakdown, and the two men suddenly became nervous, returned my documents, and told me I was free to leave. Shaken, I later contacted the local police station to ask about undercover procedures and was told there was no record of the officers' names or any vehicle matching the description. I was informed that I had likely encountered a known criminal group that impersonates police officers to rob, assault, and harm women driving alone at night, and that the appearance of the other car likely scared them off. Story 33. This is not a single moment, but a series of events I have never fully shared outside of close family and friends. When I was about 14, both of my parents became heavily addicted to methamphetamine. My mother stopped briefly while pregnant with my younger sister, then started again shortly after. I witnessed terrifying behavior so often that I became numb to it. Nights of my mother storming into my room at 3 ante-meridiem, holding my baby sister, screaming insults at my father, demanding I look at him, while my father punched holes in walls and destroyed furniture, convinced people were watching him. This went on for nearly a year. My mother once jumped out of a moving car out of spite, and my father frequently fired his gun into the woods, claiming he was being followed. On Thanksgiving, while putting up lights, he threatened me if I was plotting against him. Days later, my parents got into a violent fight in the car while driving with my sister and me in the back seat, and he assaulted her badly while I sat frozen, terrified that intervening would get one of us killed. I spent that time protecting my sister as best I could. One day after an argument, my mother tried to strike my father with a heavy battery charger while he was driving, causing him to lose control. The vehicle flipped multiple times, ejecting my mother through the rear window, while my father and sister, restrained, survived. My grandmother came to my school the next day to tell me what happened. And when she began crying while explaining my parents were injured, I assumed they were dead and felt relief, believing it was finally over. They survived, and after a short calm period, the chaos resumed. Eventually, my mother left with my sister, leaving me alone with my father as his mental state deteriorated. He threatened to kill my dog, then pointed the gun at me, asking if I wanted to be next before killing himself. I picked up my dog and walked away as he fired behind me, refusing to turn around. I stayed with him for months, talking him out of self-harm repeatedly, hiding his gun, sleeping in unsafe places, and witnessing more trauma until he was jailed. When my parents later fought again and my father was arrested, I told police neither of them was fit to care for my sister and begged to take her to my grandmother, only to be threatened into silence. Years later, both parents are functional adults, but I do not know if I can ever forgive them for what they did to each other or for how close their addiction came to killing my sister, who was too young to remember any of it. Story 34. This was a near-death experience for me. On a family holiday to Val d'Isere for a ski trip, I went snowboarding alone off-piste. I am a confident snowboarder and had been chasing snow for years, so I felt comfortable heading into the back country by myself with a hydration pack and snacks. The outer mountains had a few attendants and lifts but were mostly bare. After crossing over to a chairlift that led to a peak with a small hut at the top, I decided to rest for about 10 minutes after boarding for 3 to 4 hours. My phone showed -8 degrees Celsius, which was normal for the area. While sitting there, I noticed a massive rolling fog swallowing the surrounding mountains, not realizing it was a blizzard until it hit me within minutes. I immediately thought I needed to get down the mountain. I strapped in and started descending, but the blizzard intensified rapidly. The initial run was a long zigzag path that was not steep, and I had seen people get stuck there before if they lacked speed. Within 5 minutes, so much snow had fallen that the slope nearly disappeared. I checked my phone again and saw the temperature had dropped to -27 degrees Celsius before it died from the cold. I began trudging through deep powder, exhausting myself quickly. I was not cold but overheated, sweating, and tempted to open my jacket to cool off, though something in my mind warned me against it. Thinking about hypothermia, I instead lay on my snowboard and used it to pull myself across the snow like a surfboard, which helped but was still exhausting. When I stopped to rest against a rock wall, I felt an overwhelming urge to sleep and had to mentally scream at myself not to. I forced myself onward until I reached the end of the zigzag and then traversed across the mountain toward a runnable section. Visibility was nearly zero the entire time. Eventually, I spotted shapes ahead that were not trail markers, and after pushing myself to reach them, I found a British couple in the same terrifying situation. We decided to stay together all the way down. Exhausted, we took turns falling behind and catching up, often losing sight of one another briefly in the whiteout. Finally, we reached a long, winding slope leading to the bottom and descended, tumbling repeatedly from exhaustion, but making it down. At the bottom, I kissed the ground in relief. We waited in silence for the bus back to town, hugged when we arrived, and went our separate ways. I reached my apartment, showered in agony and relief, drank scotch, and passed out in the deepest sleep of my life, grateful beyond words to still be alive. Story 35. I stayed in a hotel downtown in Hamilton while traveling alone. I was about 23 at the time, and only there for a job interview because I was unemployed. Around 5:30 in the evening, I went out to find something to eat since I had not eaten all day. There was a mall attached to the hotel, but everything was closed, so I walked down the street where most of the restaurants were. A group of 5 middle-aged men walked out of a store and surrounded me. They appeared to be drunk or on substances and asked me to buy their prescriptions for them. I told them I did not have any money. They said I should be able to afford at least one and that they would make it up to me. I said again that I had no money. I will never forget the look in their eyes when they started getting angry. When I tried to walk away, they blocked me and became more aggressive by the minute. People walked by while this was happening, and when I tried to get their attention, they ignored it and kept walking. I realized I was on my own. I decided to just push through them and get to the nearest well-lit place I could find. I am still surprised they did not grab me when I shoved past them. They followed me, yelling, until I went into a restaurant. then stood outside staring in through the windows for what felt like hours. I told the restaurant owners what had happened, and they said it was a common occurrence. I sat facing away from the windows for about 2 hours and did not look back.